Welcome to History Crossroads, where past meets present, and every story reveals a new path through time. In the world of espionage, truth is often stranger than fiction, and few stories are as unbelievable as those of Iosif Grigulevich, a Soviet agent who lived not one life but many. Over the course of his career, Grigulevich transformed himself from an assassin to a diplomat, and later into a respected academic. But these transformations weren't just clever disguises. Each new life came with its own web of intrigue, danger, and betrayal. How does one seamlessly infiltrate so many worlds? What drives a person to dedicate their life to the shadows? And at what cost? Today, on History Crossroads, we unravel the many lives of Josip Grigulevich, a man who wore too many hats and risked it all in the service to the Soviet Union. Josip Grigulevich was born in 1913 in Vilnius, a bustling city in the Russian Empire, now Lithuania, at the crossroads of Jewish, Polish, and Russian cultures. His family belonged to the Jewish community, which was navigating a time of immense upheaval. The collapse of the Russian Empire, the chaos of World War I, and the upheavals of the early Soviet period pushed families like the Griguleviches to seek stability elsewhere. Yosif's father, an ambitious and entrepreneurial man, moved the family to Buenos Aires, Argentina. There, the young Grigulevich found himself in a vastly different world. Buenos Aires in the 1920s was alive with the clamor of immigrants speaking dozens of languages: Spanish, Yiddish, Italian, German, blending their cultures into the vibrant life of the city. The bustling markets, tango-filled cafes, and sprawling tenements offered an unlikely backdrop for making of a Soviet spy. Even as a child, Yosef was remarkable. He excelled in languages, picking up Spanish quickly while retaining his fluency in Russian and Yiddish. His teachers noted his sharp intellect and unyielding curiosity. At home, he devoured books, ranging from Marxist theory to the great Russian literary classics. His family, deeply engaged in the Jewish community, encouraged his intellectual pursuits, fostering the qualities that would later make him invaluable to Soviet intelligence. Buenos Aires wasn't just a melting pot of cultures, it was a hotbed of political ideology. In the cafes and street corners, political radicals debated the future of the world. Marxism found a fertile audience among working class immigrants, and young Yosef was swept up in its promise of equality and justice. By his teenage years, he was attending meetings of local Marxist groups, his passion for the cause deepening with each fiery speech he heard. His ideological commitment and linguistic talent didn't go unnoticed. Soviet operatives in Argentina were quietly building networks of supporters, and they saw potential in the young Grigulevich. By his early 20s, he had been introduced to Soviet contacts who encouraged him to further his education and deepen his commitment to the communist cause in Europe. Paris, with its thriving intellectual scene and political ferment, was the perfect destination. Arriving in Paris in the early 1930s, Grigulevich stepped into a city electrified by ideas. The Sorbonne, where he enrolled, was one of the world's premier intellectual institutions, attracting students and scholars from around the globe. But Grigulevich's education extended far beyond the lecture halls. Paris, at the time, was a cauldron of competing ideologies. Communism, fascism, and liberalism were all battling for supremacy in the minds of Europe's youth. The cafes of Montparnasse buzzed with debates, and Grigulevich was at the center of it all. It was here that he first encountered the NKVD, Stalin's secret police. Grigulevich's brilliance, linguistic talent, and unwavering ideological commitment made him a prime candidate for recruitment. The NKVD didn't just want soldiers, they wanted thinkers, people capable of operating independently in hostile environments. Grigulevich underwent rigorous training, learning the fundamentals of espionage, how to gather intelligence, how to craft and maintain a false identity, and how to survive in the dangerous, shadowy world of Cold War intrigue. His transformation was remarkable. Gone was the idealistic student from Buenos Aires. In his place was an operative with a talent for disappearing into new roles, a chameleon who could adapt to any environment. The NKVD recognized that they had found someone special. Grigulevich wasn't just a spy, he was a man capable of shaping history. By 1936, Europe was on the brink of disaster. The Spanish Civil War had erupted, pitting the forces of Francisco Franco's fascist movement against a coalition of left wing Republicans. For Stalin and the Soviet Union, the war was both ideological battleground and a testing ground for future conflicts. The NKVD sent operatives to Spain to ensure the Soviet influence dominated the Republican side. Among them was Iosif Grigulevich, operating under the codename Yusik. Spain was a brutal proving ground for Grigulevich. As an NKVD operative, his mission wasn't just to support the Republican cause. It was to ensure that Stalinist ideology triumphed within the coalition. This often meant targeting rival factions, including anarchists, Trotsky's, and other non Stalinist communists. Grigulevich was tasked with identifying dissidents, gathering intelligence, and, when necessary, eliminating threats. One of his most infamous missions was the abduction of Andrei Nin Perez, the leader of the Workers' Party of Marxist Unification, the POUM. Nin Perez was a passionate advocate for a form of Marxism that rejected Stalinist authoritarianism, and his influence within the Republican coalition threatened Soviet dominance. For Stalin, such dissent was intolerable. Grigulevich and his team orchestrated a plan to neutralize Nin Perez. Under the cover of darkness, they abducted him from his headquarters and transported him to a secret location. The operation was executed with military precision, a testament to Grigulevich's growing expertise. What followed was a grim affair. After days of interrogation, Nin Perez was executed. His body was never found, and his disappearance sent shockwaves through the Republican ranks. For Grigulevich, the mission was a success, but it also marked a turning point. The weight of his actions began to press on him. He had eliminated a man not for being a fascist, but for holding the wrong kind of Marxist beliefs. It was a stark reminder that his loyalty wasn't to the ideals of justice and equality that had drawn him to communism. It was to Stalin and the NKVD. Despite these internal conflicts, Grigulevich continued to excel in his role. Spain was a brutal education in the realities of espionage, and he emerged from the conflict as one of the NKVD's most capable operatives. But as the Spanish Civil War ended in Franco's victory, Grigulevich's focus shifted. His next mission would take him far from the battlefields of Europe to the sun soaked streets of Mexico City and to one of the most audacious assassination plots of the 20th century. Mexico City in the late 1930s was a vibrant, chaotic metropolis. Its streets teemed with life. Street vendors called out their wares. Carts clattered over cobblestone, and the scent of roasted corn and tamales filled the air. For political exiles like Leon Trotsky, the city offered both sanctuary and danger. It was a place where enemies could blend into the crowd, and every friendly face might hide a blade. Trotsky, the exiled Bolshevik leader and Stalin's bitter rival, had made his home in Kayokon, a tranquil neighborhood on the outskirts of the city. His villa, fortified with high walls and armed guards, stood as both a refuge and a fortress. Inside, Trotsky continued his work, denouncing Stalin's tyranny in letters, speeches, and essays that reached a global audience. For Stalin, this was intolerable. Trotsky's survival was a reminder that his grip on power was not absolute, and his voice threatened to inspire dissent within the Soviet Union and beyond. In 1939, Josip Grigulevich, now a seasoned operative of the NKVD, was tasked with eliminating Trotsky. Disguised as a journalist and activist, Grigulevich infiltrated the circles of Mexican communists who supported Trotsky and sympathized with his cause. The NKVD's plan was ambitious and multifaceted. Grigulevich was to act as the central coordinator for multiple attempts, ensuring that Stalin's enemy would not escape. Grigulevich spent months embedding himself in the local political scene. He frequented cafes where leftists debated the future of communism and attended rallies under a false identity. His charm and intellect made him a trusted figure among activists, and his cover story, that of a revolutionary seeking solidarity with his Mexican comrades, was airtight. He befriended influential figures, gaining access to circles that brought him closer to Trotsky's villa. His reports to Moscow detailed not only Trotsky's movements, but also the loyalties of those around him. Every detail mattered: the timing of Trotsky's walks in his garden, the frequency of his visitors, and even the habits of his guards. Grigulevich's surveillance was meticulous, driven by the weight of his mission and the stakes of failure. The first major attempt on Trotsky's life was as dramatic as it was chaotic. Grigulevich played a central role in planning the operation, which involved a team of armed men storming the villa under the cover of night. The group, disguised as Mexican police officers, included David Alfaro Sequeiros, a prominent Mexican artist and communist. Their plan was to overwhelm Trotsky's guards, enter his bedroom, kill him in his sleep. As the clock struck midnight, the team approached the villa's gate. Inside, the household was quiet. Trotsky's guards, though vigilant, were unprepared for the sheer force of the attack. The operatives cut through the gates and moved quickly through the compound, their footsteps muffled against the dirt paths. Bursts of gunfire shattered the silence. The attackers sprayed bullets through the windows of Trotsky's bedroom, their aim indiscriminate but deadly in its intent. Bookshelves splintered, glass shattered, and the walls were riddled with holes. But Trotsky, ever vigilant, had taken cover under his bed at the first sound of intrusion. His wife, Natalia Sedova, huddled beside him as the bullets tore through the room. The raid lasted mere minutes, but left destruction in its wake. When the attackers fled, convinced that they had completed their mission, Trotsky emerged unscathed, though shaken. The villa was in ruin, its occupants stunned by the ferocity of the assault. The failed raid was a disaster for the NKVD and a personal humiliation for Grigulevich. Back in Moscow, Stalin's fury was palpable. Trotsky not only survived, but used the attack as propaganda, showcasing Stalin's desperation to silence him. Newspapers around the world reported on the raid, condemning it as a cowardly act of political violence. For Grigulevich, the failure was a bitter pill to swallow. He had orchestrated every detail, ensuring that the team had the weapons, intelligence, and access they needed. And yet, Trotsky's resilience had foiled them. The NKVD's response was swift. A second, more precise operation would be launched, one that would leave no room for error. While Grigulevich remained active in Mexico, the NKVD turned to a new operative, Ramon Mercader, a Spanish communist whose charm and cunning made him the perfect assassin. Grigulevich played a supporting role in this second phase, providing intelligence and logistical support to ensure Mercader's success. The final assassination took place on August 20th, 1940, when Mercader, posing as a devoted follower, attacked Trotsky with an ice pick during a private meeting. The blow was fatal, and Trotsky succumbed to his injuries the following day. Though Mercader claimed the spotlight for the assassination, Grigulevich's role in the broader operation was critical. His months of surveillance, infiltration, and planning had laid the groundwork for the NKVD's ultimate success. The mission left an indelible mark on Grigulevich. On one hand, he had proven his loyalty to the Soviet cause, participating in one of the most infamous assassinations of the 20th century. On the other, the brutal nature of the mission and its personal cost gnawed at him. Trotsky wasn't just an enemy, He was a man, one who had fought for the same revolution that Grigulevich believed in. The lines between ideology and morality blurred, leaving him with questions that would follow him for the rest of his life. As the dust settled from the assassination of Leon Trotsky, Iosif Grigulevich found himself at a crossroads. His mission in Mexico had been both a failure and a success. While he hadn't delivered the fatal blow, his groundwork had paved the way for Ramon Mercader to carry out the NKVD's directive. But in the world of Soviet espionage, there was no time to rest. The NKVD had far reaching plans for Grigulevich, recognizing his ability to adapt to new environments, slip seamlessly into different cultures, and execute their most delicate mission. By the early 1940s, World War II had engulfed Europe. The NKVD, under Stalin's iron grip, saw opportunities in the chaos. Grigulevich's assignments now took him across the Atlantic, back to Europe, where his role expanded from assassin to spy, saboteur, and an influencer. His unique talents made him a key player in Soviet efforts to destabilize enemies and consolidate influence, even in neutral territories. In wartime Europe, Lisbon became a hub of espionage. Portugal's neutrality made its capital a gathering place for spies, diplomats, and exiles. Grigulevich was dispatched to Lisbon to monitor the movements of anti Soviet exiles and infiltrate networks that could pose a threat to Soviet plans. Operating under yet another alias, he posed as a wealthy Argentinian businessman, a cover that suited him well. In Lisbon's cafes and high end bars, he cultivated contacts among European aristocrats, many of whom were desperate to escape the war's devastation. He charmed his way into their confidence, presenting himself as a neutral party with resources and connections that could help them reach safety. Beneath this facade, however, Grigulevich was gathering intelligence. He identified anti Soviet figures for the NKVD and planted seeds of disinformation, subtly shifting opinion in favor of Soviet interests. One of his key targets during this period was a network of white Russian immigrants who had fled the Bolshevik Revolution and were working to undermine the Soviet regime from abroad. Grigulevich infiltrated their circle, gaining access to their plan and feeding critical intelligence back to Moscow. His work in Lisbon not only disrupted their efforts, but also reinforced his reputation within the NKVD as a master manipulator. From Europe, Grigulevich's assignments took him back to familiar territory, South America. Argentina in the 1940s was a nation straddling ideological fault lines. The government of Juan Perón, with its populist rhetoric and authoritarian tendencies, walked a precarious path between Axis and Allied sympathy. For the NKVD, Argentina was both an opportunity and a threat. Grigulevich's mission in Argentina was multifaceted. Posing as a returning expatriate, he reconnected with old acquaintances from his youth in Buenos Aires, using these relationships as a springboard to infiltrate political and business networks. His objectives included monitoring German agents operating in the region, cultivating pro Soviet sentiment among leftist factions, and undermining efforts to smuggle Nazi war criminals out of Europe. One of Grigulevich's most daring acts during this time was his role in disrupting a clandestine operation to transport high ranking Nazi officials to South America. Using a mix of bribery, blackmail, and subterfuge, he exposed key figures in the network to local authorities, forcing the operation to collapse. Though the NKVD's motives were hardly altruistic, these Nazis were seen as potential threats to Soviet interests. Grigulevich's actions aligned with broader Allied efforts to hold war criminals accountable. In addition to these overt missions, Grigulevich worked to build alliances with sympathetic governments and political leaders. He used his charm and keen understanding of local culture to position himself as an indispensable intermediary, a man who could navigate the murky waters of South American politics with ease. By the late 1940s, as the Cold War began to take shape, Grigulevich was reassigned to Italy, a country at the heart of the post war geopolitical struggle. The Italian Communist Party was one of the largest and most influential in Western Europe, and the Soviet Union was determined to ensure its success against growing American influence. Grigulevich's mission in Italy was to bolster communist efforts while simultaneously sabotaging anti communist factions. He worked closely with local operatives, organizing propaganda campaigns, coordinating strikes, and funneling Soviet funds to key leaders. His ability to blend into high society proved invaluable as he navigated between diplomatic events and underground meetings. One of the most audacious acts during this period involved infiltrating a conference of anti communist leaders in Rome. Disguised as a journalist, Grigulevich gained access to the event, recording conversations and photographing documents that he later transmitted to Moscow. The intelligence he gathered not only provided insight into Western strategy, but also helped the Soviets counteract them with precision. Throughout his missions in Europe and Latin America, Grigulevich's ability to reinvent himself remained his greatest strength. Whether posing as a businessman, a journalist, or a revolutionary, he adapted to each role with uncanny ease. His linguistic skills, cultural fluency, and deep understanding of human psychology made him nearly impossible to detect. But this constant reinvention came at a personal cost. Grigulevich's life was a series of masks, each one carefully constructed to conceal his true identity. While he remained fiercely loyal to the Soviet cause, the toll of living in perpetual deception began to weigh on him. The isolation of his work, the need to maintain secrecy even among allies, and the moral ambiguities of his actions created an internal conflict that he could never fully resolve. By the early 1950s, Grigulevich had become one of the NKVD's most versatile and effective operatives. His missions across continents had disrupted enemy networks, advanced Soviet interests, and solidified his reputation as a master of espionage. Yet, for all of his successes, his name was barely known outside of the corridors of Soviet intelligence. In the shadowy world of espionage, anonymity was both a shield and a burden. Grigulevich had become a ghost, a man who moved through history without leaving a trace. But the NKVD had one more role in mind for him, a role that would push his talents for deception to their limits and bring him face to face with the dangerous world of high stakes diplomacy. By the early 1950s, Iosif Grigulevich had perfected the art of becoming invisible. His missions in Spain, Mexico, Europe, and Latin America had cemented his reputation as one of NKVD's most versatile operatives. But his next assignment would require a transformation unlike anything he had attempted before. It was no longer enough to simply blend in or infiltrate political circles. Now Grigulevich would have to fully inhabit the role of a diplomat, an official representative of a sovereign nation. His target? The heart of Western Europe. His role? The ambassador of Costa Rica to Italy and Yugoslavia. The operation began with meticulous planning. To the NKVD, Grigulevich's skill set was ideal for the role. Fluent in Spanish and French, with an aristocratic bearing and an impressive understanding of Latin American politics, he could easily pass as a wealthy and well connected Costa Rican. All that was needed was the paperwork, and Stalin's intelligence machine ensured that his new identity, Teodoro Castro, was beyond reproach. Teodoro Castro was presented to the Costa Rican government as a businessman of great means, with strong ties to Europe and an interest in serving his country diplomatically. Using a mix of bribes, forged credentials, and subtle persuasion, Soviet agents managed to secure an official appointment for Castro as Costa Rica's ambassador to Italy and Yugoslavia. It was a masterstroke of espionage, placing a Soviet operative in one of the most prestigious diplomatic positions in the Western world. In Rome, Grigulevich slipped seamlessly into the world of diplomacy. His new role gave him access to the political elite of Europe. He attended high society events, mingled with ambassadors, and charmed his way into the confidence of powerful figures. As Costa Rica's representative, he was seen as a neutral and benign presence, a man whose interests lay in trade agreements, cultural exchanges. But behind the scene, he was gathering intelligence on NATO operations, fostering relationships with communist sympathizers, and feeding information back to Moscow. Grigulevich thrived in his role. Dressed impeccably and in tailored suits, he exuded the confidence and charm expected of a diplomat. His mansion in Rome became a hub of social activity, where politicians, aristocrats, and intellectuals mingled under the pretense of diplomatic camaraderie. But these events weren't just social occasions, they were intelligence gathering opportunities. Every conversation was a potential source of information. Every guest was a potential target for influence or manipulation. Grigulevich was adept at steering discussions subtly, drawing out details about military alliances, economic policies, and political tension. His reports to Moscow were detailed and insightful, providing the Soviet Union with a window into Western strategies during the early years of the Cold War. But being a diplomat wasn't just about hosting parties. Grigulevich was also attended high-level meetings with other ambassadors and government officials. He sat in on discussions about trade agreements and international cooperation, carefully taking note of any hints about Western defense plans or internal divisions within NATO. His ability to remain calm under pressure and project an aura of trustworthiness made him an invaluable asset. One of Grigulevich's most dangerous assignments during this period involved the plot to assassinate Josip Broz Tito, the leader of Yugoslavia. Tito's refusal to align with Stalin's vision of communism had made him a thorn in the side of the Soviet Union. By 1952, Stalin's patience had worn thin, and the NKVD was tasked with finding a way to eliminate it. Grigulevich, as an ambassador to both Italy and Yugoslavia, was perfectly positioned to carry out the plan. His diplomatic immunity allowed him to travel freely between the two countries, and his access to Yugoslav officials provided him with a clear path to Tito. The plan was audacious. Grigulevich would either poison Tito at a state function or orchestrate a public attack that would leave no room for doubt about the Soviet Union's message. The pressure on Grigulevich was immense. The NKVD demanded perfection, and the stakes were higher than ever. But Stalin's death in 1953 abruptly changed everything. The assassination plot was shelved as the Soviet Union entered a period of internal upheaval, with Stalin's successors scrambling to consolidate power. Grigulevich was recalled to Moscow, his career as a diplomat and as a spy suddenly over. Grigulevich's time as Teodoro Castro left an indelible mark on him. For years, he had lived a life of lies, maintaining a false identity that required constant vigilance and emotional control. While he had carried out his missions with remarkable success, the strain of living in the shadows was beginning to take its toll. His role as a diplomat was perhaps the pinnacle of his career, but it was also a deeply isolating experience. He couldn't confide in his colleagues or build genuine relationships. Every interaction was calculated, every friendship a facade. This isolation, combined with the moral ambiguities of his work, created an internal conflict that he would carry with him for the rest of his life. Iosif Grigulevich returned to Moscow in 1953, a man without a mission. For over 2 decades, he had lived a life defined by danger and deception, working as one of the Soviet Union's most versatile operatives. But with Stalin's death and the subsequent reshuffling of Soviet priorities, his days as a spy and diplomat were over. For most, this would have marked the end of their story, but Grigulevich was no ordinary man. He would reinvent himself once again, this time not as a covert operative, but as a scholar, a historian, and an intellectual. In his new role, Grigulevich would leave behind the world of espionage and step into one of quiet reflection and academic rigor. However, even in his reinvention, the ghost of his past would linger, influencing his work, shaping the legacy he left behind. Grigulevich's transition to academia was no accident. His extraordinary ability to absorb and synthesize information, his linguistic talents, and his extensive knowledge of international politics made him uniquely suited to a scholarly career. While his work as a spy had relied on quick thinking and adaptability, his new life as an academic demanded patience, focus, and a deep dive into the history and culture of Latin America, a region he had come to know intimately during his years as an operative. In the mid 1950s, he joined the Soviet Academy of Sciences, one of the most prestigious academic institutions in the Soviet Union. There, he began to focus on the history of Latin America, exploring topics ranging from the revolutionary movements to colonial history. His work was exhaustive, drawing on both his personal experiences in the region and the wealth of information he had gathered during his missions. His first major publication, a study on the revolutionary leader Simon Bolivar, was met with critical acclaim within Soviet academic circles. The book painted Bolivar as a proto socialist hero, a figure whose struggle for independence in Latin America aligned with the ideals of the global communist movement. While some criticized the work for its ideological bias, few could deny its depth of research and compelling narrative. Grigulevich's scholarly output in the following decades was nothing short of prolific. He published extensively on Latin American history, writing biographies of figures like Che Guevara and Salvador Allende. His works blended meticulous research with a deep understanding of the political forces shaping the region, earning him recognition as one of the Soviet Union's leading experts on Latin America. In 1979, Grigulevich was inducted as a corresponding member of the Soviet Academy of Sciences, a testament to his contributions to the field. By this time, he had published over a dozen books and numerous articles, solidifying his reputation as a respected intellectual. His work was widely cited both within the Soviet Union and internationally, though few outside his intimate circle knew of his past life as a spy. Despite his success, Grigulevich remained an enigmatic figure. Those who worked with him in academia described him as reserved, almost guarded, a man who rarely spoke about his personal life. For Grigulevich, the transition from espionage to scholarship was not just a career change, it was a form of reinvention, a way to construct a new identity that allowed him to distance himself from the morally complex world he had once inhabited. A common thread ran through much of Grigulevich's work, the theme of revolution. Whether writing about Bolivar's fight for independence, Che Guevara's guerrilla campaigns, or the political upheavals in the 20th century Latin America, Grigulevich was drawn to stories of resistance, power, and transformation. Some scholars have speculated that his focus on revolution was deeply personal, a reflection of his own life, which had been defined by a constant struggle between ideals and reality. As a young man, he had embraced Marxism as a path to justice and equality, only to find himself complicit in acts of violence and deception that often contradicted those values. His academic work, with its emphasis on revolutionary figures, may have been his way of reconciling those contradictions, of finding meaning in the sacrifices he had made. Grigulevich's death in 1988 marked the end of an extraordinary life, one that spanned continents, ideologies, and identity. Though his name is little known today, his story remains one of the most remarkable in the history of Cold War espionage. Grigulevich's life was defined by reinvention, from a young Marxist in Buenos Aires to a Soviet assassin, a diplomat, and finally a scholar. He continually transformed himself to meet the demands of his circumstances. Yet beneath these transformations lay a constant tension, a struggle to reconcile his ideals with the realities of the roles he played. In his final role as a historian, Grigulevich may have found a measure of peace. His work allowed him to reflect on the forces that shaped his life and the lives of others, to contribute to a broader understanding of history, and perhaps to atone, in some small way, for the compromises and sacrifices of his past. Iosif Grigulevich's story is one of transformation and resilience, a testament to the power of reinvention in the face of extraordinary circumstances. As we close this chapter of History Crossroads, we are reminded that the lives we lead are often shaped by the choices we make and the roles we are willing to play. If you've enjoyed this episode, share it with someone who loves uncovering the hidden corners of history. Don't forget to follow us for more stories that connect the past to the present. Until next time, stay curious.